The talk really has two parts, and the first is very much a kind of genealogy, and it's probably it's certainly the most complex bit of the talk. And I sometimes I think of the second part of the talk, which is studies in resistance to the policy area of governance, as an add-on that I can use depending on how much time I have, but it's much more entertaining than the first part. So while I was sitting here waiting for this talk, I decided that I'll go quite quickly through the first part and spend a bit more time than normal on the second part. I just feel like it. Thank you for saying the talk will be interesting. It was you who said it, not me. I'm reminded, I can't remember who, but a British comic who commented when some politician said that they were being funny or that they were a comedian, or someone who said, "We'll be the judge." Oh, it was the literary critic who died, the atheist, said about someone who said they were funny, they were writing a satire. He said, "We'll be the judge of that." And so, fortunately, I wasn't the one who said it would be interesting, because I'm not sure it will be, but I hope at least a bit on resistance will be vaguely entertaining. Okay, so here we go. What does governance look like today in Europe? And what I want to do is suggest that the best way to understand it is historically. The talk's going to have quite a lot in it. There are going to be 3 points in the talk. I'm going to stop and say, actually, I think I'm saying something very different from what most of the literature says. And we're going to begin with one of those points, which is that most of the literature in the social sciences as a whole acts as though what social science does is describe and explain a world that's out there. My talk is premised on a very different view. I'm going to suggest that what social science does is make the world in which we find ourselves. Social scientists virtually never say this, but at some level it's just obvious. If there's an idea that comes out of social science and policymakers adopt that idea and implement it in policy, then social science is making the world. So I think the best way to understand contemporary governance in Europe and probably elsewhere is to look at how ideas from the social sciences have impacted public policy so as to make the world. And that, as you can see, is what you're getting in this rather complex slide above. So, like all good genealogies, I want to start with a form of knowledge that is very contrary to what we have today, which is what I'm calling developmental historicism. And in that form of knowledge, people understood the world historically. It led to a concept of rationality that was really fairly civilizational. So societies were understood as developing historically in accord with something like an internal civilizational logic. If you come out of this building and you walk past Barrows out to the streets, you get Bancroft, Channing, Durant, and those are the great 19th century national historians of America, who understood America as having a particular history and understood that history as a guide to what America should do in policy terms and where it was going in the future. Virtually everyone in the 19th century approached the world in that way, through historical explanations. Virtually no one used the formal models, formal correlations and formal classifications that dominate modern social science. Right? So modern social science arises historically and contingently in the early 20th century. And it takes two main forms, and these are the ones under modernism government in the slide. So there's an economic form of social science. What both these forms have in common is their modes of explanation are resolutely ahistorical. Right? So they reject the historicism of the 19th century. In economics, that takes the form of starting with assumptions, deducing models from that, and then exploring the relationship of the models to the world. In sociology, it takes the form of looking at abstract units, atomizing bits of the world into units, and then looking at the relationships between the units and trying to find correlations, classifications, or system-like explanations that account for the role of the units in relation to each other, either by finding mathematical regularities across time and place, or by postulating functions, so the role of the unit within the wider function. So the explanations that arise with modernism are what we might call synchronic, that is, they're ahistorical rather than being diachronic, that is, historical. And initially this modernism is housed in the corporate and welfare state, so crudely put, economic models of knowledge are used to govern the economy, while sociological models of knowledge or forms of knowledge are used to govern the development of the welfare state and social administration, because they identify who's in need, how to tackle who's in need, how to solve problems of need. And all of this knowledge is housed within the bureaucracy. And my crude argument is that governance arises, I'm going to explain what I mean by governance in a moment, governance arises as and when those forms of knowledge turn, and instead of being things that are housed within the bureaucracy, become the basis for offering critiques of bureaucratic organisation. Right? And as they critique bureaucracy, so the state gets transformed. All right, so that's roughly what I'm going to do. So, governance is normally understood, and I'm understanding it like this, as a shift from hierarchical bureaucracies as a mode of public action or public organisation to markets and networks. So a term within the state away from bureaucratic organisations, what you might think of as, say, the DMV, towards the use of markets, contracting out, privatisation, and also towards networks, joined-up governance and whole-of-government agendas. When I was at a university, it was a public university like this, I'm betting the cleaning was done by employees who were employed directly by the university. And I'm absolutely certain that the equivalent of the Bears Lair was full of shops that were owned and run by the student union itself. That's not so anymore. Not only is it not so here, it wouldn't be so at the university I went to in the UK. Instead, those activities, cleaning, the provision of coffee, have been contracted out. Right? Some other private sector entity performs those roles and is paid to do so, right? Or bids to do so, depending on quite how it works. All right, so we're going to spend very little time on this because I've just talked you through it. First, there was developmental historicism, the main point of which in this talk is to indicate just how unnecessary social science is. Isn't that a good word? Unnecessary social sciences, as in the sense that there are other ways of thinking about the social world, and that for much of human history they have dominated, and that the idea that what we need is formal synchronic explanations is a historically contingent matter. And we live in a world where that contingency now governs how we are ruled. Modernism, the synchronic explanations have both these two aspects to them. There's the economic one and the sociological one. They're housed within the state in the period right up to after the Second World War. So Keynesian economics comes out of the economic form and is something that's housed within the Treasury or the Department of Economic Affairs. Sociological rationalities govern most of the rest of the state. But then in the 1970s, European states experienced a fairly well-known crisis. For various reasons I won't go into, but one of the reasons is that these forms of social science start to offer critiques of the state. So neoclassical economics and its offshoots in rational choice and public choice theory are arguing that bureaucracies are inherently unresponsive. And they're arguing that the state is inherently unable to develop beyond a certain size without the economy stagnating. And likewise, people coming out of institutionalist and functionalist traditions are arguing that the welfare state is failing to address the very problems it was designed to address. So the narratives that are being offered by social science switch from being narratives that are compatible with a bureaucratic state to narratives that are attacking it. And if that's right, then we can think of governance, so the rise of markets and networks, as happening in two waves. In the first wave, arguments and ideas coming out of economic modernism, like neoclassical economics, promote marketisation, contracting out and privatisation. In the second wave, arguments coming out of sociological modernism, things like the new institutionalism and systems theory, promote the rise of joined-up governance, network governance and public-private partnerships. And we're going to look at both waves hopefully fairly quickly, starting with the first wave, which I'm going to spend almost no time on, because it's a fairly familiar story, which is a bad, nasty thing, because I'm left. If you're on the left, it's bad and nasty. Some people might think it's a good thing. But a bad and nasty thing called neoliberalism emerges. And it emerges out of neoclassical economics and rational choice theory, and it spreads not only to attempts to revamp the private sector, but also to the reform of the state, where it inspires marketisation, privatisation, contracting out and new public management. So I think a fairly well-known story. The bottom of the slide would be concrete examples, but I'm going to skip over those because it's well known, and I'm going to give you the concrete examples to help flesh out this story in the second one. The reason for the concrete examples is that critics of my view of these things are inclined to say, are you really saying that social science has this impact? And the answer is yes, I am, but in a complex way. So I'm saying often it's folk understandings of the social science rather than me myself who's having this impact. And often it works through things like think tanks and policy workers rather than through high-level academia. So I am saying it has this impact, but through a complex chain, and the examples are meant to illustrate how that works. All right, so then now we're going to just pause. The second controversial thing I want to say, remember the first was social science makes the world rather than simply describing it and explaining it. The second is we don't live in a neoliberal world. So the left is inclined to talk as though we live in a world that is incredibly neoliberal, and we just do not, unless you want to give a very expansionist definition of neoliberalism. If you want to define neoliberalism as anything that comes after the 1970s and involves something like a move away from standardised state services and organisation, maybe we do. But if you want a tighter, more genealogical notion of neoliberalism, as rooted in neoclassical economics and its idea that markets are inherently efficient and that this means we should turn towards markets, new public management, etc., then we do not live in a neoliberal world. On the contrary, since roughly the 1990s, no policymaker in Europe whatsoever almost, and virtually none in the US, and certainly none in the UN and the development world, have been neoliberals. Instead, they have been influenced by what we might call network governance. They see markets as perhaps efficient, perhaps not. In order to be efficient, markets need suitable institutional locations. They need the support of the state, etc., etc. So we live in a world in which there's been a move away from arguments dominated by neoclassical economics and what I'm calling economic modernism towards what I'm calling sociological modernism. And people tend to neglect that. They tend to focus on the first wave of reforms, these ones, and neglect these ones. And that's why I'm going to spend more time on these ones than on the first wave of reforms. So in the second wave of reforms, institutionalists, functionalists and systems theory develop a critique of both the first wave of reforms but also of bureaucracy. So they tend to argue that yes, it was the case that bureaucracy was inefficient, but no, it is not the case that markets are efficient. On the contrary, markets, particularly in the public sector, have often further fragmented organisations in a way that makes it increasingly difficult for the state to exercise control and to coordinate, and therefore we need extra effort to overcome even more additional problems. Right? The most popular form of the institutionalist argument situates it historically. So it says, yes, there was a time when bureaucracies were okay, but now we live in a world which is characterised by global flows, global finance, fast-paced change by technology, and in those worlds bureaucracies aren't any good because you need faster change, and where you get faster change is networks, so we need networks. Right? That's probably the most common story. But another version would just be networks are inherently efficient and bureaucracies are not, because networks contain things like trust, which makes for greater synergies. Note the formal notions of networks that's there. Networks are defined by, e.g. the existence of trust, the need to exchange resources. They're a formal historical type of organisation which necessarily seems to have these properties. I think that's wrong, but that's how institutionalists see it. And because they think networks are efficient either necessarily or necessarily in our contemporary global context, they want to replace not only bureaucracies but also markets with networks. So you get another wave of reforms which is built around networks, partnerships, collaborative governance, etc. And I think that wave tends to get neglected, so I'm going to mention a couple of examples. First, and the key example I'm going to mention is the idea of wicked problems. So wicked problems is actually a technical concept that arises in the planning literature in the 1970s. And the idea of a wicked problem is that it intersects with other wicked problems, and any attempt to solve it is likely to change it. So let's think of an example. Let's imagine that we want to deal with inner city crime and vandalism. Right? So that looks like it's a law and order problem. But then we find that most of the crime and vandalism we're interested in is being done by children who are playing truancy from school. So now it looks like an education problem. And then perhaps we find that most of the children who are playing truancy from school come from broken homes where the mother's out at work in the absence of suitable childcare. So now it looks like a social welfare come employment problem. So how do you solve it? Well, the argument that's associated with the idea of wicked problems is that the traditional organisation of the state into these department silos, crime, education, social welfare, is peculiarly unable to deal with these problems that cut across the silos. So in order to deal with wicked problems, what you need is joined up governance, or a network that connects these different departments in order to produce a coordinated response to the relevant problem. And of course, if you think for a moment, you'll realise that virtually all the main problems of modern societies are wicked problems, so understood. So what it means is the state needs to become a network form of organisation, right? So that's an example of an idea that then inspires networks in the 70s planning theory. Now, how does that enter politics? Well, because you might think, well, it's just coincidence. But in the as far as I can make out, the first time a word like whole of government or joined up governance enters the policy literature, at least the Anglophone policy literature, because my English is a lot better than my French or my German, is in Australia. And the actual policy document where it appears, it's called Wicked Problems, a joined up solution. So it actually is appearing explicitly where the idea of promoting joined up government or whole of government is first introduced explicitly as a response to this idea of wicked problems. So I think you can trace particular ideas from institutionalism into the series of policy reforms that are being adopted. But I also think you can find the individuals, not just the ideas, the specific individuals who act as policy entrepreneurs and take ideas from the academy through the think tanks into policy making. Right? And my example here is Perry Six is actually a person. He changed his name by deed poll. And in the 1990s, Perry Six, who I've never met, but I think is probably a very nice person because I have had written communication with him. Perry Six was employed at the University of Strathclyde in Britain, where he ran academic conferences with titles like The New Institutionalism, a Neo-Durkheimian Perspective. So in the academy, he's actively involved in trying to reinvigorate mid-level sociological style explanations at a time when they seem to be under assault from rational choice theory. Right? He's actively defending what I'm calling sociological modernism and its reinvention. At the same time, Perry Six's main job, remember he's an honorary research fellow at Strathclyde, his main job, I think, was working for the left-wing think tank, which now exists in America, but then was only in Britain, Demos. And for Demos, he wrote a series of policy papers on things, some of which just had titles that were things like holistic governance. He always used holistic governance as opposed to joined up or whole of government. But also things like housing, a holistic governance solution or a holistic solution. And then when New Labour was elected, Perry Six was intimately involved in writing its white paper on the reform of the public services. So you can actually track these ideas through individuals. I could do the same with Jerry Stoker, who was also at Strathclyde, then Manchester, then Southampton universities, who was an advocate of institutionalist social science, an advocate of network governance, and one of the architects, although he would claim he didn't have much effect, on New Labour's new local government reforms. Right? So you can actually find the individuals who take these ideas from the academy. So that's my genealogy. I've got more to do because we've got the second bit, but that's basically my genealogy. Social science makes the world. If you want to understand why we live in a world in which policymakers are trying to replace bureaucratic hierarchies with markets and networks, the key is to understand how modernist social science has come to make critiques of the state on behalf of the efficiency of markets and networks, and to understand that those ideas, which are historically contingent, have been picked up as policymakers and kind of pushed out as policy agendas to make the world we live in. I'm talking about governance, but I think we could do much more. We're all sitting here in Berkeley. For those of us who are subject to the endless trail of emails we get from the Berkeley administration, I think we could talk about our lives now being increasingly ruled by attempts to move towards markets and networks and away from bureaucracies. I think if you're in a private sector organisation, you could tell the same. So to some extent, this is just a generic story about how certain social science contingent forms of knowledge or forms of rationality have come to dominate the way in which people across all kinds of organisation now try to govern us. Notice I say try to govern us, because that brings me to the third point I want to make, which is compared to most of the critical theories, which I think I'm part of things like governance, I think we need to be very aware that what I've told is a story of policy intentions or official discourse, And there's a huge gap between official discourse and what the elites would like to happen and what actually happens. And far too much of the work that's done on genealogies or governmentality tends to act as though once you've read a discourse and found that it fits in a pattern of something like neoliberalism, you've shown that's what's happening. And I think that's rubbish, really rubbish. So the third point I want to make that I think is novel and unusual is if you really want to understand governance, you can't stop with that kind of genealogy. You need to engage in something like ethnographic work to understand how all kinds of actors, senior civil servants, street level bureaucrats and citizens make practices in the context of that policy agenda. So I think that policy agenda I've described is really widespread. It's arisen in different European countries in different ways. In Britain it arose initially because Thatcher brought it in and imposed it on a population and particularly a civil service that was, if anything, hostile. So it was a political party with an electoral mandate imposing it, in effect. In Denmark, parties never really believed in it, but the civil servants in the Treasury Minister certainly did. And they then imposed it as a form of expert advice on politicians who remained at best sceptical. So how the agenda gets introduced varies country to country, but I think it's fairly widespread. How the agenda plays out, I think, varies dramatically, country to country, policy sector to policy sector, depending on the forms of resistance it meets. So I'm just going to run through one example of resistance at each of the levels I mentioned: senior civil servant, street level bureaucrat and citizen, starting with the senior civil servant. So this is Sir Richard Mottram, who's very high up in the British civil service. And he's talking about joined-up government, which you will remember from what I said earlier was New Labour's main set of reforms of the British public sector, was to promote joined-up governance or networks or partnerships as a way of solving the problems of both bureaucracy and markets. Sir Richard Mottram, when we were interviewing him about how this came about, what did he do about it, he said this: "When I was in defence, we had long since discovered joined-up government. It's presented as such a revolutionary idea, but I had worked for my whole career in defence on the basis that we joined up everything we did with the Foreign Office and with the Cabinet Office and with 10 Downing Street. It was just deep in our culture that this was the way you worked, and we got it off to a fine art." Now, I love this as an example of resistance, because I bet you're all sitting there thinking, but why is that resistance? So let me explain why that's resistance. Imagine that your it's also, apart from the fact that you won't know until I explain why it's resistance. Sir Richard Mottram, sir, and senior civil servant, this is a white guy in a grey pinstripe suit. This is not where you think resistance comes from, but I suspect this is the most important example of resistance you're going to get today. Right? So, imagine you're Tony Blair. You have this revolutionary agenda which is going to utterly transform the British public sector, and it's called joined-up governance. And you hand it over to Sir Richard Mottram and the other senior members of the British Civil Service, and you say, this is my big idea, we're going to really transform things, go out and make it happen. And they all sit there with Sir Richard Mottram and they go, yeah, that's a good idea, let me think, what should we do about it? Well, actually, we don't really need to do anything, because we're already doing it. So there's no real need to do anything, great, and they don't do anything. So what you have is resistance, and this is a massive form of resistance that people should acknowledge more often. I suspect this is the main form of resistance to similar initiatives from the Berkeley administration, for instance, is, yeah, okay, but then no one does anything. Right? And that's what you get right at the top of government. And also, this particular example helps me to make another point, which helps to explain why resistance varies so widely. Which is, if the genealogy of governance was about universal forms of social science being imposed upon us, resistance is about our local traditions, right? It's about the folk ideas we grow up with and that we encounter and we inherit before we get hold of social science, as it were. And in Britain, the de facto culture of the senior British civil service has been something called Whiggism, which is really the notion that the British Constitution is great, probably perfect, but it does need to adapt slightly every now and again to meet changing social circumstances. So what Richard Mottram is doing is reading a radical set of reforms through that tradition. And he's saying our constitution and the way we do things is pretty good, but we need to evolve slightly in order to meet the changes. So it's not that he's deliberately and consciously resisting, he's not. He's just understanding the directive he receives from New Labour through his own mindset, which is one of a Whig tradition, which has the effect of domesticating and slowing down the reform.
Yes, Minister.
Yeah, yes. For anyone who's seen Yes, Minister, of course, that's what Yes, Minister was all about. So now we move on to street level bureaucrats, and I also love this story. Obviously, I love all my stories of resistance, or they wouldn't be here. But this is my second favourite. They're almost in order of my favouritism. So this is a police officer being interviewed about attempts to introduce community policing, which again was part of the whole network joined up agenda. So the idea is that the police need to network and build in relationships with local businesses, with local schools, etc., and that this involves teamwork amongst the police, etc. So the police officer, one that we interviewed a lot, but one of them says, command and control, which is traditional bureaucratic hierarchy, command and control is situational. In my team, I don't have subordinates, I have team members. I invite their ideas and input and encourage them to talk to me. However, as I said, it's situational. Terrorism is a good example. As a commander in a crisis, when I want something done, it isn't up for negotiation. I tell the troops we have to rely on command and control in these situations. Right? Now, on the one hand, that might just seem like mild resistance, just a little bit on the side, because let's face it, there's not a lot of terrorism. I mean, I know it seems like there is at the moment, but there isn't. It doesn't enter most police officers' activities on a day-to-day basis. The problem is, of course, that if you're a police officer, every urgent mode of action looks more like terrorism than like community police work. You're called out to chase down a criminal. You're called out and there's a dangerous... And particularly, all the bits of policing you really love, which is why you join the police, look more like terrorism than like holding people's hands. Right? So if you talk to police officers time and time again, they assimilate everything they're asked to do to a paradigm in which the main form of organisation they actually want to adopt and will need most of the time looks more like hierarchy than it does like network. So although they seem to be allowing for networks, they're actually marginalising them, and community building is being marginalised and pushed to one side, and most of their actions they say, but this is an exception and we need to just go back to our normal pattern of command and control for this particular circumstance. Right? So again, form of resistance. Also, I suspect, just as on the first form of resistance, this is probably a massive one on the Berkeley campus, in effect. So they probably, you can imagine the administration saying to us, we don't have subordinates, you're not below me. No, we have team members, we have faculty self-governance. But no one believes it, or if they do, they don't live in the world I live in, that's for sure. You aren't filming this, are you? Okay, and then the third and final form of resistance comes from street-level citizens and what they're talking about. And this is just a health user, again in the UK, talking about the attempt to introduce markets and private forms of healthcare and or networks, right? But mainly it's a kind of marketisation. But both markets and networks here are meant to be promoting choice. There's a study done showing that if you get beyond a certain amount of choice, like all the orange juice in American supermarkets, it actively erodes your happiness. And I'm pleased to say that when I came to Berkeley, I looked at the health choice options and I thought, good God, this is way too much. So I signed up with Kaiser and I've been very happy with them ever since. And the only reason I'm with them is that they look so like the NHS. It was great. I could just go in and they would do everything for me. So I was trying to avoid choice, which is pertinent here as we come to our British health user who says patient as opposed to customer. So part of the marketisation agenda was obviously to say that citizens should be understood as customers more than as citizens. Patient is the traditional term, and I think it is still appropriate. The NHS is a service to users in the local community. I know consumer and customer imply choice, and that is what we are supposed to want. I would consider it an acceptable achievement if everyone could have what was best in the matter of treatment as of right. There are certain cost considerations, but that is another issue. Choice may be a political ploy to take our eye off the ball and confuse us as to what really matters. Choice sounds a good thing, but is it? So all down the line, what you have is senior civil servants, street-level bureaucrats and citizens who are implicitly or explicitly resisting the intentions of policy elites and creating complex practices, right, which vary from policy sector to society to society. My best guess, I know bits of Europe quite well. I don't know anywhere outside Europe anything like as well. But my best guess, for instance, in Africa is that basically everyone says, yes, yes, we will do what you want, now give us the money, takes the money and then doesn't do any of the reforms whatsoever. Right? My best guess is that something similar goes on in the Soviet Union, ex-Soviet Union area, whenever that comes up, and that this is why you get the patterns of governance you get in those areas. So I think even there you could extend this analogy, this kind of genealogy of governance from Europe to other societies. So what does all this mean? Well, partly because I don't really like formal social science, fairly obviously. This is a genealogy which argues that it's ruining the universe and trying to govern me in ways that I don't like. Because I don't like it, I'm very reluctant to draw up formal conclusions. And what I really just want to say is it's a mess. It's a mess that has arisen as you've got this global agenda which people assume is going to work, but actually just meets resistance and therefore never works, but fails in really interesting ways that differ according to the particular forms of resistance that it meets. But nonetheless, I've tried to draw out three very general conclusions which I will end the talk with. So the first is bureaucracy still exists. Personally, I'm a bit of an anarchist, so I shouldn't really say this, but I'm tempted to say hooray! I'm tempted to say, isn't it great that bureaucracy still exists? Because it enshrines some really important democratic values, like accountability and equality of treatment. And the more you move away from bureaucracy, the more you lose those values. Right? So I'm tempted to be really pleased that bureaucracy still exists. But boy, does it. To the point where I will assert outright, even though I don't know how I can prove this, one of my problems with formal social sciences, I never know how you measure these things. So when people say networks are proliferating, my problem is, although I can use the word network, I don't know how you would individuate a network and say this is where it is and this is the limit to that network. And if you can't individuate networks, I don't know how you can count them. And if you can't count them, I don't know how you can say the number is increasing. And the only way you get out of that problem is to operationalise the concept of network in a way that actually is false and misrepresents what a network is. And you probably acknowledge that simplification, but then you act as though it doesn't matter. But boy, does it matter, right? So although I can't prove this, I'm going to say that not only does bureaucracy still exist, but in my informed opinion, let's say, it remains by far and away the widest form of public sector organisation and action across Europe as a whole. And I think that's great. And part of the reason for that, but not the only one, is markets are resisted. No one likes markets. It's astonishing people haven't worked this out yet. They really don't like markets. Virtually no one likes markets. You'd introduce markets into education, into healthcare, because we're talking about Europe, so it has public sector healthcare normally, into pensions. People don't like it, right? People don't like it. Senior civil servants don't think it will work. The street level bureaucrats really, really don't like it and oppose it. Citizens are deeply suspicious of it. So markets meet so much resistance that it's really hard even to inch forward in creating anything that looks like a real and functioning market, even given the fact that you never encounter actual kind of pure markets in any context whatsoever. So it would be better to say attempts to move towards markets are really resisted. And finally, think of the police office, for example. Community networks are neglected. Everyone says, what a great idea, and then does nothing. Right? And if you interview, even to move from the policeman slightly up the scale, if you talk to like local government managers who run local government areas, they all talk about the fact that they're involved in networks. And they all have like keep in touch meetings that are part of building the network. But if you ever say to them, can you give me one example of an institutionalised aspect of this network, they really struggle. Maybe one or two, there's a formal shell, and then if there's a formal shell which meets once a month and you say, and what power does that have, or where does that meeting have input into the wider policy sector? Again, relatively few areas. So networks tend to be a thing that people like the idea of and they like the sound of and they sign up to the language, but generally speaking they only do if they have some spare time, and because they're public sector workers in an area where people are refusing to give them any money or to employ any more public sector workers, they don't have any spare time, so they don't do anything to build the networks. Thank you.